and welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I am Taylor Rockwell, and with me I've got a man who's still serving his 3-match domestic ban. It's Daryl Grove. Hello, Daryl.
Hello, what have I been banned for?
Oh, I think you were just sent away, probably for elbowing podcast opposition, so you were sent away, but you can still perform in your native country, just not in the domestic United States for the next 3 pods.
So I'm the Bobby Wood of the Total Soccer Show?
Yes, that's correct.
So yeah, if anyone's seen the footage, Bobby Wood stuck an elbow into someone's belly this weekend.
Yeah.
Got himself a
lower
red card.
abdomen.
Lower abdomen. Hamburg lost 3-0. All the goals came after Bobby Wood was sent off.
Yeah.
Have it noted. And the Deutsches Fußballbund, I believe is the German FA, have suspended Bobby Wood for 3 matches.
They have. And I understand it's not like that vicious of an elbow. It probably was a bit oversold by the recipient of said elbow, but it's still malicious contact. It's still, he knows what he's doing. Can't really argue with it, even if it is kind of a bummer.
And I think this is part of what we saw during the Copa, right? We saw some fire from Bobby Wood, sometimes in a good way, but a little too often in a bad way, in a way that looked like it would lead to trouble.
Yeah, I mean, and it has here, and I think that's a big problem for a Hamburg team that is struggling in the Bundesliga at the moment. When you need, I mean, he is like their leading goal scorer with 2 goals.
Yeah, it's not saying much, is it?
No, it's really not. So, but I think that's definitely not gonna like endear you to the manager by any stretch of the imagination, and it's definitely not going to help your team. So it's the type of move that you understand why he does it, because he's feisty and scrappy and isn't going to put up with that kind of nonsense. But by the same token, it ends up with that player still being on the pitch and you being suspended for 3.5 games.
So the other thing is 3 1/3, because it was the 60th minute.
Yeah, okay.
The other thing is we had some questions about whether he'd be suspended for the US-Mexico game.
We did.
I don't think that's how it works. I think only if you're suspended by your own federation, sort of like US Open Cup suspension, for example, is when that comes into play. But the thing is, he's not going to be playing between now and the Mexico game. Right, so he's going to at least have a week where he's less sharp than he should be. I don't think he's been in great form anyway, so this might be the thing that knocks Bobby Wood out of the starting lineup for the US national team.
I mean, given the form of Jordan Morris and Josie Altidore, it kind of makes sense that maybe you give them a look and see what they can do while they're in playoff form versus Bobby Wood. That said, the flip side of that would be Bobby Wood then is rested, isn't coming in the middle of the playoffs, so might not be quite as battered and bruised. Maybe he's a little fresher and ready to go.
Well, if you want Leslie Jones to watch, you got to start Jordan Morris.
This is very true. So, and that is a priority. We all know. So I did have that one intro for you about Bobby Wood. I also had a second intro for you, which is a man who's worth 500,000 euros a week. I'm guessing you can guess what that's in reference to?
I can. This morning I did the Goalmouth, and the lead story was Gareth Bale now being the best paid player in world soccer at €500,000 a week.
That's true. But then you alluded to this idea that maybe Cristiano Ronaldo's deal, which is currently being finalized, will be as impressive. Do you think that that's from a weekly wages standpoint or from like a release standpoint or both?
I think probably from a weekly wages standpoint. That would make sense, right? Because I think, as I understand it, the Ronaldo deal, the sticking point is the length of the contract. So I think they're really seeing it as how long can we pay him an outrageous amount of money and he'll still be sort of top of his game, which means he'll be there until he's on the decline a little bit, right? So then you don't need a massive release clause in his contract.
And I'm one of those believers in that he takes his like physical fitness so seriously that I don't really know when he's going to decline. It's kind of
he's going to be the Stanley Matthews of Portugal. He's going to play till he's 52.
Maybe not that much, but I would say more so like more akin to, say, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, who is older but does prioritize physical fitness to the extent that maybe it won't matter so much. But yeah, I like the idea of them giving him like 500,001 euros a week just to make him the highest paid player.
I love those soccer stories. I absolutely love those soccer stories. Have you heard the thing of Trevor Francis signing for Nottingham Forest?
No.
So when Trevor Francis signed for Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest, the big story was that he was the first £1 million player in history. But Brian Clough deliberately made it £999,000, 999 to make sure it was one under, just to stop him getting too big of a head. Wow. At least that's the story. That may be one of those apocryphal things that's too good to not be reported as true.
That seems a bit ridiculous. Well, so we've got our finances down, we've got our suspensions down. So should we get to some listener questions? Should we get those down too?
Yeah, let's get them down. We've got 2 to answer today. First one I have here in front of me, Taylor, is from Ira Jersey. Hello, Ira, and Isaac. Ira says, One of the changes US youth soccer recently made, along with the calendar year age limits, meaning you're now sort of your birth year, right, is your soccer year, is going to 7v7 and 9v9 for younger players. And I think Ira is coaching some of these youth teams. He asks, what is, in your opinion, the formation or formations that best mimic full-sided formations? So he's essentially asking what to do now that it's 7v7 and 9v9. I think he also explained that formerly it was 8v8, which left him 7 outfield players, and that he could essentially do a 4-4-2 and just take one player away from each line to have a 3-3-1. But now he can't do that.
Right. So you got to adjust it a little bit. And I did want to say, first of all, that maybe for those coaches out there who are having this similar question, who are coaching at this same level, I think your first priority is not necessarily to win games, to be the best team in your league. It's more about getting those like 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old players to learn how to play the game properly. And that's sort of where my formations come in answer to this question. It's about getting the formations that do kind of roughly correspond with actual formations in an 11-a-side game, but also teaching the players how to play those positions properly so that it's not just some like, oh, okay, we're just going to run all over the place. We don't really know what we're doing, but we'll put the big guy up top, and that should get us some goals.
So to give some background before we get into our formations, Taylor, this is part of the new player development initiative that US Soccer has been rolling out. It's in transition now. It's going to be mandatory by August 2017. What happens is up to, how old is it? 12 and under play 9v9, 10 and under play 7v7. Just so everybody knows, on pitches that are adjusted to that size. Can we start with the 10 and under 7v7? Because there's an interesting wrinkle to the game there.
Sure. What's the wrinkle?
The build-out line. Do you know about this?
No.
Okay, so the build-out line is added for 10 and under, and it's an extra line between sort of the top of the D and the midfield circle, right? So it's roughly a third up the pitch over each side. And what happens is you can only be offside beyond that line is one thing. But also when you're the defending team and you're bringing the ball out from the back, the opposition attackers have to get behind the build-out line so that you have room to play out to begin with. It's to encourage the players to pass and move out of the back instead of kicking it long, because headers also, deliberate heading also banned in this age group, right?
Thank you for those reminders.
So we're going to have a whole generation of players passing the ball out of the back, and they'll be given the room to start the move, much like I'm sure Pep Guardiola would like to have.
Yeah, I think so. I think he would definitely appreciate that, given his proclivities.
And then the other thing I read, sorry, before we get into it, the other thing I read is the reason they did this, making the side smaller, 7v7 instead of 8v8, is the common sense idea that the fewer players on the field, the more touches each player gets. And that's the most important thing. Right. And I wanted to ask if you agree with that concept, because I think I do.
Yeah, absolutely I do. I mean, that's why small-sided games are the preferred way for training for a lot of clubs. That's why you what do you call them? Is it rondons, or what's your term for a 5v2?
Well, it's not my term. So in England, it's called the box. In Spanish, it's the rondo.
The rondo, thank you. Not rondon. Not Solomon Rondon. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why like a lot of clubs will just do that in training. They'll just do 5v2 because it's like tight space. You have to pass quickly, think quickly, move quickly. And I think that definitely corresponds to having fewer players on the field. Means you're still going to have the same more size touches. Field, but it means more touches. Yeah, because I think too quickly in U.S. soccer in years past, players would... I think when I was playing at U10 or U11... I think U11 is when we jumped to 11 aside. And,
I did the same. It's crazy. It was crazy.
It's too big. Exactly. Yeah. And you then have to practice like trying to get corner kicks into the box because players aren't physically capable of kicking the ball that far at that point, really. And it just kind of changes your approach to the game just because of little things like that. So
and then it also, there's so much space that it benefits. If you've got one fast guy, that's it. You can just kick it over the top and your fast guy can run after it. Right, when there's too much space to run into.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and that's where, I'll admit that when I was coaching, it was more for me about I want my team to win. And it didn't really register to me that also part of that is supposed to be like developing comprehensively, like technically gifted players.
Yeah.
And so I would definitely do that. We had our big guy up top who could score really good goals, but then once that's what he's really good at, I think we've talked about this on the show before, that's what he's going to do. But at a certain point, he's not going to be the biggest guy on the field anymore, and then he's suddenly not as technically developed as the smaller players who had to develop their skills, because otherwise they're never going to be able to compete.
And then he's going to wish he'd been a swimmer instead when he's looking for a college scholarship.
This is true. I do have one question, though, that I don't know if you can answer, and maybe only like U.S. soccer officials. What do you do on corner kicks at this age? Do you not have corner kicks anymore? Does it have to be throw-ins or something? Because if you can't,
you can just go short, right? Or you can fire it in low. And if the defending team can't head it out, then that's okay, right? Because then they can't clear it either. So the ball's going to sort of land in the box, and someone's going to have to try and control it.
I have to admit, I'm still not the biggest fan of this rule, of the no-heading rule. I know there are reasons for it. I'm probably, less informed than people who've been researching this for, decades. So I'll agree that there's probably medical reasons why it's not great, but I still love a good header. So that's where I am on that one.
Let's leave the heading for adults, though, whose brains are fully developed.
Yeah, that's probably fair. So let's just move on to tactics instead, shall we?
Okay. What would you do then, Taylor? What would you do? 7v7, 10 and under.
My usual preferred formation for a 7v7 is a 2-3-1.
I'm with you.
I think it's the most basic formation in terms of coaching, trying to get some combination of technique with tactics, because you've got like the two defenders, though, because it could be two center backs. The three, you've got the central midfielder, you've got the two wide midfielders who can kind of function as standard wide midfielders. You've got the one player up top. So I think that is probably the most basic one that allows you to do the most to develop players. Well, no, let me change that. It allows you to do the most to develop both players and tactics in combination.
I absolutely agree, because I think it has the benefit of being sort of a basic shape, right? You can picture the 2-3-1 kind of like a star shape almost, but with two at the base. It also, if you draw it out, it has natural triangles, right?
Yep.
Because the two defenders are like slightly spread apart, and then there's a central guy ahead of them, and then like every player has a triangle of players around them. And then it also encourages to me when we've played it, because we played this when we played indoor, right? We played 2-3-1, and I really like it. I'm always mortified when if I play for an indoor team and I'm just guesting or something, and they have some weird new formation, I'm just like, oh no, this is not going to work.
Yeah.
It encourages a bit of interplay, right? Because there will be times when one of those two defenders gets forward, and then maybe that central guy or one of the wide guys has to drop in, and you get a bit of positional switching going as well, but keeping the same basic shape. And that's what I really like about it.
Yeah, because that's the biggest thing for me is with that shape. And this is where I was saying that I think at this age group, it's not necessarily, you shouldn't be focusing on how to teach counterattacking versus when not to step too much. And if you have something like a 2-1-2-1 or different formations that I've seen out there, or like a 3-1-2, and those two fullbacks have to get forward all the time. Like, I think that's too much for an 8-year-old's brain to understand.
Yeah. It's also potentially a massive pitfall, right? Because if you base your formation around your fullbacks getting forward all the time, but then they have two really good wingers who are always getting in behind you, then you've got to change everything.
Exactly.
It's not very flexible.
So that's where I think that being too experimental can be a problem at this age group, because I think it's more about kind of teaching players just basic responsibilities, and then, as you mentioned, those kind of simple passing combinations that they can learn to control the ball, move the ball, pass the ball, and it's not just sort of dribble, look for the big guy up top. That said, the other one I would suggest, there's two more formations I think correspond somewhat to current formations. I think you can do that 3-1-2, which I think is more akin to a 4-3-3 in current soccer, where you have like that kind of one playmaker. You've got the two forwards. Then you have those kind of wide guys who can get forward. I don't advise that as much as I would say a 3-3, just a flat 3-3. And I think that's because with that formation, you can emphasize everybody plays everywhere, so you don't have one kid who's just suddenly a defender always, even though he's 8, versus one kid who's a forward. So you really can do that rotation of like, what does the right midfielder do? Okay, today you're on the right midfield. What does the left defender do? Okay, you're the left defender. And you can kind of get everybody playing every position, but with that comes that sort of almost like false nine fluidity, where everybody can move around, everybody can pass and move and kind of change positions during the game, so that it helps you to understand overall the approach to like kind of technical soccer.
That sounds wonderfully utopian, Taylor, but don't you end up with 3-gap-3, which is sort of always the terrible thing that can happen when we play indoor, because that's my only frame of reference for 7v7.
Yeah, and that's
massive gap between the two lines.
And
right?
that is the thing. It's like, yes, it's definitely a utopian concept, because the idea there is that like no one is a pure forward. You have 3 defense-minded players, you have 3 attack-minded players, but everybody has to get back and defend.
Yeah,
I think that's what you teach them. The problem is, speaking from experience of coaching like that age group roughly, somebody wants to be a forward. Everybody wants to be Ronaldo. Everybody wants to be Zlatan. Nobody wants to be Gerard Piqué, even if he is married to Shakira. It doesn't matter. And so and that's what you are going to have in that situation is you're going to have those 3 kids who all want to be the ones to score the goals. You're probably going to have 2 of your 3 defenders who want to be the ones to score goals, and you're going to kind of constantly have to deal with that gap. And that's why, even though those formations, I think, do have real-world correlation, I think in the end, that 2-3-1 is the ideal setup.
Agreed. Okay, I sign off on that and gavel it.
Cool.
Moving forward a couple of years, right?
Yeah.
12 years and under, so from 10 to 12, you play 9v9. 11 and up, you introduce headers. Mm-hmm. So it's 9v9 for a couple of years, heading 1 year, no heading the year before. So what's your ideal formation for 9v9? And I've got to say, this is the one where I struggle a little bit because I've never played or coached in sort of a 9v9 environment. So I sort of don't have a feel for what's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
I did read up and I saw the 2 recommended formations were 3-2-3 and 3-3-2, which seems kind of obvious, but I wonder if you had any insight into how that works.
Well, I think the 3-2-3 is essentially a 4-3-3. It's the idea that you have attacking fullbacks again. You have 2 midfielders who are kind of responsible for controlling the midfield. I think usually you'd play them flat as kind of more defense-minded. Those are maybe you're a little bit slower, but you're more technical players that can kind of collect the ball, find the players. Those are going to be your like kind of midfield generals, I think. Then you've got in that front 3, you've got the 2 guys who can get back a little bit, but they are sort of your pacey attackers. You've got your forward there. And I think that's where I say it's more at this age group, it's better for kind of like tactical development, because I think once you're 10 to 12, you can get an idea of, oh, I'm on the left side of that attacking 3, but I know that I need to get back a little bit. And you can work with those individual players to teach them how to perform that role. I don't think that you can do that as well when they're 8. So that's where I think that 3-2-3 is probably, that's why it's recommended, because it kind of is most closely resembles, I think, a 4-3-3 and helps players kind of adjust to that style of play as a result.
And would you, if you were a coach, would you change anything formation and approach wise from 11 to 12 when you introduce headers for the first time?
No, because I think I'm assuming the build out line is removed at that point.
Yes, the build-out line is removed from 10 and up. So once you're playing 9v9, there's no build-out line. It's for 7v7 only.
And so I think this is where I'm probably a little bit outdated, because I would still say that this is where you teach them to try to build out of the back, but then you also teach them how to win headers, because I do think that that's part of why you have these kind of limitations in place, is because at this age group, that's when you're supposed to teach how to properly head the ball. And that is a really key, important thing at this age group, because it becomes players tend to be able to know what they're supposed to do roughly. They know how to play. They know how to pass the ball and shoot. What they don't know how to do is square up to win a header properly, so you're hitting it with your forehead and not the top of your head. They don't know how to get their body behind the ball. So what you end up seeing, I think what I had to teach over and over and over again at this age group was don't jump. Because everybody wants to, you get so nervous when you're a little kid that, say, the punt is coming in, you kind of don't know how to gauge it properly. You're a little bit scared to head it. So what you end up doing is just kind of jumping at the ball once it bounces. And it always goes over your head.
Yeah. Or catches you on the back of the head, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what you have to do is teach kids how to get their body behind the ball and square up to the ball, and then try to win that header from there. So that's where I think you can kind of introduce that gradually, but I think it still makes more sense to focus on playing out of the back there. Maybe heading comes in once you've got corner kick situations. Maybe you can work on flick-ons for throw-ins, or heading it back for throw-ins, some of that Brazilian training that we've talked about on previous shows. That's where maybe you can incorporate heading. Yeah, exactly.
All right, do you feel like we've got this pretty much covered?
Well, I'll say the other two ones that I would say are worth investigating. Let me make sure.
It's a massive grain of salt coming with this, right?
Well, it's so I think a 3-2-1-2 is kind of the rough equivalent of a 4-2-3-1. You have
all right, Patrick Vieira.
Yeah, you've got your defenders, you've got your 2 holding midfielders, you've got your one attack-minded kind of central midfielder. Then you can send your 2 forward players wide, so that you kind of have greater stretch of the field, basically. So you're not just playing through the middle. And then a 3-4-1, especially if you did that midfield 4 as a diamond, I think that's also a pretty easy system for players to understand. But I think overall, I would stick with a 3-2-3.
Yeah, it's a lot of pressure on that 1 up front, right? Yeah. Especially 9v9.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I've talked a whole lot. Do you have any thoughts? Do you disagree with anything I've said? Do you have any addendums to what I've said, or your own formations that you think could work?
I think the only thing I would say is in 7v7, it's okay to have the 1 up front because the field is so small, and then it encourages the sort of, especially the wide players, to get forward and get involved, right? And there's enough space that you can sort of start having some combination play and everybody can get forward and still keeping those two back, right? But beyond 7v7, I would say never go one up front.
Yeah. I mean, well, I guess it depends.
So there's one kid gets stranded then, right? There's one kid gets stranded and might not get enough touches.
Well, I think it depends, because you are going to have those situations in games. If you are playing more defensive, if you're playing a 4-5-1 or a 4-2-3-1, you might have that player up top by his or herself. I think it's more, the biggest thing I would say in all of this is that it's more about fighting a system, playing that system, but then trying to figure out why things aren't working. So, like, a lot. I
was thinking just more in terms of getting the player some touches, right? I just wouldn't want to accidentally have one kid that gets no touches in a game.
Well, yeah, I mean that's fair. But what I'm saying is, like, say that happens in a game, then what I think your job as a coach is to look at what happened there and think, why was he isolated? Did he not know how to make a run? Did he not know how to get involved? Were my midfielders too far back? Do they not fully understand their role? What I'm saying is that I think a lot of times at these age groups is people tend to think like, oh, the formation isn't working, we need to try something different. And I think it's more about stick with the formation that you feel comfortable with and then coach within that from game to game. So
that makes sense.
If your midfielders weren't getting forward, if that forward was isolated, then it's your job as the coach to figure out, what do I need to do to make sure that those midfielders know to get forward next game? What do we do in our practices this week to get those guys understanding their roles so that next week that one up top isn't so isolated?
Okay, that seems fair. The final thing I'd like to say then is just a thing I remembered from reading the rules is that coaches are sort of mandated. They have to spread playing time around evenly. So like the 7v7 game, I think you have a maximum roster of 12, but all those kids have to play an even amount of minutes, right? So I guess it's good to not have a formation that just relies on the skill set of one player, for example. Like if you've just got one fast guy up front and then you only score goals when he's in, but then the other kid's playing and it doesn't work, maybe it's time to think of something a bit more inclusive.
Yeah, I think so. And I want to say, speaking of being inclusive, we talked about goalkeepers on the last show.
Yeah.
Goalkeepers, it's going to be tough to have kids at this age that are like, yep, I'm going to be a goalkeeper for the rest of my life. Some kids will want that, but not necessarily. But what I think you should do if you're the coach is not just be like, all right, this is my goalkeeper, go stand in goal, we're just going to fire shots at you this practice. Like, it's still about, you still got to work on teaching that goalkeeper how to play with his or her feet so they can pass out of the back like we talked about. But it's also about coming up with drills that teach players how to play goalkeeper properly, but how they become kind of the general that can see everything. And it's not just sit in the back and let us fire shots at you. That also can be a bit of a problem that maybe people tend to not think about in practices.
I think goalkeepers are sort of the drummers of soccer. So I think you should go around and see if any kids have formed rock bands in the area, and just talk to all the drummers, see if they're interested in playing in goal.
Yeah, that works for me. I like that plan.
All right, Taylor, we've got time for one more question today. It is from Ed D. Horatius.
It certainly is.
Coach Ed. So we've got two coaches asking questions today.
Hey, I like it.
But Ed's question is not about youth team coaching. It's about professional minor league soccer. So brace yourself, Taylor.
Oh boy.
Ed says, can you explain the business structure of professional minor league soccer in America? Ed says that it seems odd that there are two separate leagues, the NASL and the USL, each of which is a different level of minor league soccer. Right, so USL is Division 3, NASL is Division 2, at least for now. Who determined that, Ed wants to know. Is there some centralized organization that dictated that? Did the leagues themselves choose that structure for intended financial viability? What are the advantages and potential disadvantages of teams moving from NASL to USL? Finally, is there any financial link or oversight between MLS teams and the associated USL teams, or is each team an independent financial entity? A lot of questions there, Taylor. I will let you take your pick from all of them.
All right. Well, I'll start with who determined that. Is there some centralized organization that dictated these decisions? The answer is yes, it's US Soccer. So US Soccer has their sort of standards for what makes you Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. And then you operate within those standards. If the USL, who are now applying for Division 2 status, they say they've been operating at Division 2 standards for long enough time that they feel that they can make it viable going forward. But I think a lot of that relates to like the size of the population. Like you have to have a certain number of people in your city. It relates to stadium capacity, attendance, all of these different factors play into what your status is going to be, what your league is going to be.
Yeah, I did some research. It's 75% of your teams need a metro market of 750,000 or more. It's also about like how many time zones you have teams in, how many teams you have. It's a minimum of 8 teams, at least in the first year. And by year 3, 10 teams. By year 6, 12 teams. So I think the attendance was at least 5,000 capacity for each stadium. And I believe that USL meets those standards. And I also know from a Richmond Kickers, because that's our local team, Facebook page update, the US Soccer, I don't know what they call them, like investigators or what's the right word? I guess they're investigators.
I think auditors.
Auditors, that's it, yes. Came to check up on the standards and the facilities at City Stadium, the Richmond Kickers, and to see if USL meets D2 standards. So that is happening right now.
Interesting.
And I know that the last time there was a decision made was January 2015. So I would expect a decision from US Soccer in early 2017.
That sounds like a fair estimation, a fair approximation. Yeah. So then we should maybe go into why there are 2 minor league systems at present. Yeah, I mean, we don't know the full history, right? Because a lot of it happened behind closed doors. But there was essentially a split round about 2009, 2010, and then 2011. 2009 to 2011, I think, is where the splitting occurred.
So a lot of what were then USL teams split off and formed the NASL,
right,
which it began play in 2014 as a rival to USL and possibly to MLS as well. And they do operate under, it seems, slightly different principles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest one being that the clubs that split off to form the NASL, they were looking at the writing on the wall and seeing that USL was kind of actively positioning itself to be underneath Major League Soccer. And I think that has, since that time, been proven to be correct. You look at the way they kind of rebranded together in a kind of similar step. You look at basically the affiliate programs, the second team programs that have come into place in USL, and you see that, it's definitely sort of putting yourself directly underneath Major League Soccer, whereas I think those breakaway clubs wanted to be more of an independent organization with the possibility of challenging Major League Soccer or more easily gaining entry into Major League Soccer by proving that you are kind of your own system, your own setup.
Yeah, do you see NASL as a league that was sort of set up that it thought maybe with a more free market system might be able to rival MLS eventually? Because I can't see it ever forcing a sort of merger in the way that other US sports leagues eventually did. I'm thinking like basketball, is it the ABA eventually forced a merger? But I think when you have such different operating principles, like individual teams responsible for their own finances, no salary cap, versus the centralized MLS way of operating, there's no way that ever was going to result in a merger, right?
Well, I think the caveat here would be that you do have NASL teams joining Major League Soccer. I mean, and so there is
league. I'm sure the league isn't a huge fan of that, right?
That's the difference, right? And that's why that initial statement. Is it Bill Peterson is the commissioner of the NASL? Yes. His point was but no, we see that as a positive, that our clubs can just seamlessly jump into Major League Soccer. It shows that we're not that far off of first division status, right? But that's the way he argues it. But what I would say is that more so, those clubs are leaving the NASL, and it's not like they're sticking with their NASL principles of free market, we can pay our players what we want. You are actively deciding to go play in Major League Soccer where you will accept the limitations thereof. So it's not just, we're joining MLS, but we're changing the way MLS is structured. It's we're joining MLS to play the way MLS wants us to play. Yeah,
absolutely. It's like revolutionaries into the 60s who sold out and bought into the system.
Yeah, sure.
Is how NASL would view it.
It's sort of like, man, I would like to sleep on a mattress, so it's time for me to put on a suit. Yeah, it does kind of feel that way.
No more ramen noodles.
Or maybe it feels like the people who went out to explore the American West and I don't know, settle Deadwood and that type of thing, and then it's at a certain point you're like, maybe I just want to move back to my small town and kind of function within the normal rules of society that might not be that exciting, but definitely keep me from dying in the wilderness.
Well, should we talk about the two financial structures?
Sure.
So if you look at USL, it's not as if USL has a salary cap or officially any of those MLS restrictions, right? It's more that just because so many of the teams in there, like Los Dos, LA Galaxy 2 and Portland Timbers 2 and Seattle 2 are owned by MLS teams, there's almost like a natural salary cap in place because no one's going to get paid more to play on those teams than they are in MLS. And even for the Richmond Kickers, right? Richmond Kickers have a budget that they work within because they're an independent team, even though they're affiliated with DC. They're not going to be paying someone crazy money to come and play for the Kickers because if anyone's going to be good enough and famous enough to earn that money, they'll go to MLS anyway.
Right.
So it's sort of like a de facto salary cap.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's maybe the limitation there. That like NASL clubs, first of all, you have the history of the NASL, where I think it's fair to say that if I say NASL, the first word that comes to mind is probably Cosmos. And you have that kind of lineage of, or history of big players coming in. And it's not just those. I mean, really a lot of players that we know who are now coaches, who are now pundits, played in the NASL at some point. They have these weird connections to North American soccer.
Well, almost any great player you can think of, like Bobby Moore, or Johan Cruyff, or Franz Beckenbauer, George Best, they all played in NASL.
They did, exactly. And so I think that's part of it, is that with the NASL, you can convince players like Freddie Adu and Joe Cole to go play there because it has that history, and you can kind of build it as like we are. I'm not saying they did this, but the way I've always understood NASL is like we are kind of the rebel outsiders who aren't going to have this single owner system that everybody does their own thing, everybody has their own ownership structure. We're going to make this work, and we're going to make it work to bring back this kind of formerly glorious, famous league. And I think that you lose some of that prestige, some of that mystique once you move into USL because of what you mentioned, that you have those guys coming in for these kind of big name clubs to play against 12-year-olds from, was it Montreal? FC Montreal, were they all like 16, or was that Toronto? I forget which one it was that we watched.
It was Montreal had a lot of youngsters. They weren't quite 12. They were a little older.
They were like 16 to 19. Everyone, I think the oldest player on that team, they had one like 21-year-old, and that was it. Yeah.
Well, since you brought up the Tampa Bay team, Joe Cole and Freddie Adu play, we've got to talk about the recent developments, right? Sure. We touched on it when it happened, but Tampa Bay and Ottawa Fury are both jumping ship from NASL to USL. Minnesota are leaving NASL for Major League Soccer. So that leaves them with 9 teams right now in NASL. And then Rayo OKC and Fort Lauderdale Strikers are apparently a little dodgy financially.
And Charlotte are also apparently looking at possibly moving to USL as well.
You mean Carolina Railhawks?
Sorry, excuse me. Not Charlotte. Yeah. Carolina. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's already Charlotte Independence in the USL, right? It is kind of hard to keep track because teams jump back and forth now.
A little bit. Yeah.
But yeah, on the other hand, USL had 29 teams in 2016 and is going to have, I think, 30 in 2017 and even more. 31 in 2017, yeah. So it's getting bigger and bigger. I think by 2018 there'll be a central conference as well. And to me, it has the stability of USL now is because of the number of teams. They can sort of consolidate geographically so that teams don't have to travel all across the country, right? There's the Eastern Conference. They just play the Eastern Conference teams. Western Conference just plays the Western Conference teams. So they can keep within budget for their travel. Whereas if you look at the map of NASL, it's so far from Puerto Rico up to Edmonton.
Yeah.
It's almost mind-boggling that teams would be willing to do that.
Yeah, can you imagine like if you played them one week in Puerto Rico and then had to go all the way up to Edmonton to play the next week in Edmonton?
Yeah.
It would be a bit of a change, I would say. A bit of a change.
And I understand why USL did it as well, because I don't know if you remember this, if you were paying attention at the time, but the Kickers made it to the USL Championship in like 2008 or 2009. They had to go away to Seattle, right? Yep. So you've obviously got to go and play in the championship game, but I believe they took a financial loss to go and compete in the championship game because it's so far and so expensive to get an entire team, an entire soccer team and support staff all the way to Seattle, especially when you eventually lose on penalty kicks.
Exactly. Yeah. So it doesn't quite work that well. Exactly. So yeah, I mean, you break it up and then you kind of make it more manageable for clubs. But again, I think that's where if you're looking at it from if you're a billionaire looking to buy a soccer team, maybe MLS doesn't really fit with what you want because you don't have as much freedom to buy the players you want and to be the Roman Abramovich of Major League Soccer.
Yeah.
But with NASL, you do, but you don't have that guarantee of stability or existence. So then you look at USL, and again, USL, it's the second tier with a lot of clubs that are sort of like bringing in young players and trying young players and like, you know, kind of guys who aren't quite making the starting 11 or the match day squad for that MLS franchise. And it doesn't really give you, the solid investor, much of like an attractive opportunity for investment.
Can I talk about it as a fan as well? Just as a fan of soccer in America, I think I'm ready for stability. I'm ready for things to settle down and then not be like a war between, a Cold War sort of between NASL and USL. I'm ready for everybody to just sort of accept, okay, this is where everything is, this is where everything goes, and we're going to go from here. And I'm kind of, I've had enough of the instability in NASL because it makes me worried. And I've got this feeling that it's almost, even though they look at it as, I think, being more open and maybe more optimistic. I think it actually holds things back because we're all slightly worried about what's going to happen going forward. You know what I mean?
All right, I think there's probably going to be a lot of soccer fans who disagree with what I'm about to say, and there's probably going to be a lot of history fans who disagree with what I'm about to say. But Daryl, are you familiar with what happened after the American Revolution in the United States?
Oh, nothing good.
Okay, well, there was the Constitution, right?
I was making a pro-British joke.
I know you were, but you got the U.S. Constitution. You know that there was a document before the Constitution?
I did not know that. The Bill of Rights?
The Articles of Confederation. So before the United States was like a constitutional republic, it had this kind of like loose confederation of states, which theoretically was good in the idea that it allowed each state to operate according to its own rules and regulations and everything. But it basically it was insane. So that like you had taxes between states, so that if you wanted to bring one good from one state to another, it was completely like unregulated but regulated. Just you had no real central government, so there was no system for like proper taxation, and it just became a huge problem that didn't work. And the United States, which wasn't the United States at the time, basically went bankrupt immediately and was very looking likely to like fold or be retaken over. Then you have the Constitution, which kind of
like Rayo OKC.
Exactly. And then you have the Constitution, which gives you kind of a centralized authority, and that's the difference I see, is that Major League Soccer, it maybe takes away certain rights. I think that people would be people who don't like Major League Soccer are frustrated by, but it does give you that stability that the everybody do your own thing and we'll see what happens system doesn't quite provide. So I think I'm with you in terms of it's nice to have a league that is, because I remember, and we've talked about this before, when Major League Soccer retracted. And it was this idea that like, oh yeah, losing 2 clubs is a really good thing. It could be great for the league. And I didn't really buy that at the time. And I was like, I don't know, 16? So to see it now have 20 teams, have doubled in size, it's much more stable and positive, and that's the type of growth that I would prefer, even if it means maybe less freedom of player movement and ownership overall.
And one major thing I think about, and this brings me around back to Ed's question, right? Mm-hmm. Ed was asking about the sort of business structure of professional minor league soccer. I think the thing that most people would like in the United States is some sort of promotion relegation system, right? And I think a lot of those people are sort of into NASL because NASL has this idea of sort of spend what you want, don't be constrained by all the MLS stuff. But I think the weird paradox and irony of all this is if NASL instead bought into the system the way USL did, eventually you do have that sort of you have that constitution instead of these Articles of Confederation. Once everything is organized and structured and everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet, I think then you've got more chance of having promotion relegation, right?
Oh, we've got history and religion in here. And let's bring in some politics just to bring it on home, shall we?
But you get what I'm saying? Like once everybody sort of agrees the way things should be shaped, then you've got much more chance of things being organized in a way that makes promotion relegation a possibility.
Sure, I'll agree with that in theory. I don't think that you're going to have promotion relegation. I wish you did. I think the only way you do, I think that you and I have talked about, is that you make it that like you have MLS 1 and MLS 2, and then you have 40 clubs, you have 20 in the top tier, 20 in the bottom tier, but it's like this very fluid idea of teams can move up and move down. It's not quite the like financial gap that you have in, say, between like the Premier League and the Championship. But I don't think that once you have this stable group of 32 teams, which I think the league will eventually get, I don't see how you then are suddenly like, and now half of you don't get to play in the top tier anymore. It doesn't really work that way. I think it has to be from the ground up.
Did you read the Will Parchman article from maybe a month or so ago when this Tampa Bay and Ottawa Fury stuff, when that news broke? He suggested over at Top Draw Soccer, that this is a chance for USL to eventually institute some sort of promotion relegation between its own 2 divisions. So you could have like a USL 1 and a USL 2 with promotion relegation between, and then eventually you have an MLS 1, MLS 2 with promotion relegation in between. And then you can sort of stack those on top of each other. And then eventually you can think about making it porous between MLS 2 and USL 1 sometime in the far future. Like when we've got like colonies on Mars kind of situation, but eventually, right?
I guess that is a fair point, because one of the things, was it PhillySoccer.com? Is that the page I sent you that we were discussing where they had like the 3-part history of the USL and NASL split?
Yes.
So if you look at their history of like the USL into Major League Soccer into present day, that USL has been, I would say, at least 10 different names. It's been so many different leagues that have changed name and changed their structure that I think it is, easy to believe that you could then have that shift that you're talking about, where you do have, okay, now we've been USL for this long, now we have 40 teams, now we are going to split into 2 divisions, because it's not like they have just this long, proud history of being this one thing, and we're never going to change. It's definitely a very fluid system.
They were USL 1 and USL 2 not so long ago, but with no promotion relegation in between. It was just like a top tier and a bottom tier, and we just place you where we think you financially fit, which is sort of the system we end up with anyway, right?
I think, you've got MISL, USISL, A-League, A-League 2, USL Pro, USL Pro 2. It's been a lot of different
and
names.
Richmond Kickers, they're through it all.
Yeah, exactly. I have enjoyed in all the articles I've read, seeing, like, certainly you have some stable USL clubs like Richmond. I was like, hooray, we're in there. Good stuff, guys. Good stuff.
So do you think we've answered Ed's question satisfactorily? I feel like there's so much to talk about with minor league soccer, and we've tried to hit it all, but I'm sure there's something we missed.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, we don't tend to talk promotion relegation too much on the show. I think that's probably could be a whole series of shows if we so chose.
Yeah,
but I think a lot of other people have already done that.
That's true. It's definitely out there if you want to find it. Yeah. I'm looking at Ed's question one last time. The one thing he did ask, is there any financial link or oversight between MLS teams and their associated USL teams? And the answer is that essentially the USL 2, the Seattle 2, Portland 2, Galaxy 2 are basically owned by the company, the like LA Galaxy, Seattle, and Portland Timbers.
Yep. So, Daryl, as we said, there are 31 USL teams. Do you know how many of those 31 teams have an affiliation of some type with an MLS club?
So not just like a second team, but the way that the Kickers are an affiliate of DC?
Yeah, and I'll give you a hint. Do you know how many MLS clubs there are?
I think it's 10.
No, like total MLS clubs. Like
MLS,
how many?
Like,
yes.
You mean MLS teams in USL?
No, MLS teams, period.
Oh, there are 20 plus Minnesota and Atlanta.
Okay, so there are 20 current teams. There are 20 teams with affiliate deals, or like with some sort of relation. Yes, so 20 of the 31. Basically, every MLS team now has either an LA Galaxy 2 style team or that affiliate that we've talked about with, say, Atlanta and Charleston. Where you have,
that makes sense.
Yeah, so it can be any kind of system they're in, but yeah, they all have kind of taken that approach because obviously it benefits them quite well. But then you have LA Galaxy 2, finances are probably intertwined versus, say, Richmond and DC. I think Richmond do their own thing, but take those 4 players from DC.
And just loan a goalkeeper when they need it.
Yeah, which is every game. Yes.
All right, Taylor. There we go. I hope we've answered Ed's question. Ed, if you have any follow-ups, contact at TotalSoccerShow.com. If anyone else has questions they would like us to answer on the show, again, contact at TotalSoccerShow.com. If you are a subscriber at the $10 a month level or higher, we guarantee to answer one of your questions a month within reason.
Alrighty, well, Daryl Grove, thank you for taking the time. I look forward to you being back in the country, but I'm glad that you're getting some Englishness back in you.
Is that right? You're hearing a few words and phrases sneaking back in.
Well, I think, yesterday when we were trying to figure out the technical setup, you were like, yeah, we'll give it a bash. And I was like, oh boy, I'm going to have to get used to this. Because you do, I forget that when you come back, you do have like a little bit more of the slangness about you than you usually do.
It's good to get a little refresh, right? A little topper.
I think so. I mean, that's why I think you've been with me when we've been in particularly southern areas, and all of a sudden my southern accent comes out. I'm sure it's equally jarring.
Like, who's this guy?
Why do you say lie cat? I don't understand.
All right, Taylor, it's been a pleasure.
All right, buddy. Talk to you soon.